Okay, so I was contacted by the History Channel some years ago. This was 2000 and, I'm not very good with dates. I think it was 2007, around there, 2008. I got contacted by the History Channel, and they were doing Monster Quest. I'm sure a lot of people know the Monster Quest series. So it was all about great white sharks. And they wanted me to attach, a camera to a great white shark, because I had attached cameras to great white sharks before. So I figured, okay, I'm gonna try something new. And usually we tag the camera onto the shark, and I'm gonna tell you how we did that the first time. In fact, I'm gonna tell you how we did that, and then we'll get to Guadeloupe. So we're working with the BBC, and now I'm going back to 93, 94. And it was a 7-month project which took place in the Farallon Islands and then Dyer Island in South Africa, and the Farallon Islands are in Northern California, then Dyer Island in South Africa, and then Straits Bay. So we had a lot of we saw so many interesting things take place, and I actually described quite a bit of it in White Shark Behavior. And working with Peter Scoons and Doug Allen and Paul Atkins and Greg Marshall. I mean, these are legendary guys when it comes to filming, wildlife guys, and it was amazing. Anyway, so Greg and the BBC guys arrive, and I meet them for the first time. And Greg Marshall, a hell of a nice guy, he's there, and he's got this torpedo. It looks just like a little torpedo. And what he's very cleverly done, he's taken, in those days, the top of the range camera, small camera, was a high 8. So he took a high 8 camera and he stripped it down to all the cover and everything off, and he made it as small as possible, and he put it into this little torpedo, this tube, which was called Critter Cam, and was designed to put on marine animals. And it flew. So depending on whatever animal they put on, like a turtle, they could capture a turtle and put it on, and then off it would go, and they could film what a turtle did. But how do you get a camera onto a great white shark? So we sat down, we discussed it, and he said, "Do you think this is possible?" So I said, "Absolutely, we can do this." And that's the nice thing. We've never ever said this cannot be done. And I'm very proud of the fact that one of my staff, Gerald Engelbrecht, he once said to me, "Craig, you know what? If there's anything you've taught me, is that there's nothing is impossible." And I really believe that is something that is the way you should look at life, especially when you're working right at the top of the food chain, that F1 team. Nothing is impossible. So we figured this out, and he had these galvanic links. He'd obviously done this before, and Greg Marshall put a lot of thought into it. Now, a galvanic link slowly dissolves in seawater. But they're very brittle, they're quite fragile. So we had these little tags, these tags that we used to put our own tags into the great white shark. So what we did, we attached the cable we took a tag apart, we took the tag head, stainless steel tag head, and we attached the cable to that, about that long, and then we put a galvanic link in it, almost like a swivel, but a connector. And then from there, we just had a little cable running to the camera, and attached to the camera. So when the shark, we'd stick it on the shark here or there, or just in front of the dorsal fin maybe. And then that was the plan. And then as the shark swam along, this little camera had fins on it. It was very nicely built, and would actually lift off the animal and fly through the water like that with the great white shark. So So then the challenge was, how do we actually get this onto the shark? You know, I mean, it was all fair and well having a camera. Now, because when you tag the shark, sometimes the sharks take off, and you got to be very careful because now this camera is fragile, and one bad bump and something inside can dislodge. You also get shake on the video. One of the seals could crack, or the lens could crack, and suddenly the thing floods, and you've got a very expensive piece of equipment in those days, a very technical piece of equipment, and it's dead. Seawater kills everything. So fortunately, I had the one with fins on it. At the bottom, it had a fin, well, a wing. Sorry, it actually had wings on it on the bottom. So I looked at this and I said to Greg, "Well, why don't we make something which so we have a pole, the application pole. So we have this long application pole." I said, then we have the head on the applicator, the stainless steel head that's going to go into the shark, and then we run the cable back as tight as possible so there's no jar. When the shark takes off, there's no jar on that link. And I said, and all we do, we design something where the wings slot into. So he said, "Oh, that's a great idea." And so we were thinking, what should we use? And just by chance, in the garage, I had a car number plate, you know, simple old car number plate lying there for some reason. And we took that out and we shaped it, we cut it, and we screwed it into this pole. So you had this super technical equipment on this very basic, and that's what I've learned when you work with great white sharks. You try and keep it as simple as possible. So, and the simple thing, so we folded the number plate over, and I don't even have to show you because I'm going to show you. So imagine that's the number plate. We just folded it like that, okay, and then we slotted it, and it went on top of the application pole like that. It's very, very technical, this. And then the wings just slid into that fold, and we held it back with a little piece of string. And when we stuck it onto the shark took off. You let the string go, and the string would just, come loose from the camera. And this is how we designed the Criticam or the application of the Criticam, and we became the first people in the world. In fact, I was the first person in the world to put a camera onto a great white shark. And it was exciting stuff because nobody had ever swum with a great white shark before like that. I mean, now you're swimming with this animal, and we picked up so much interesting information. They were swimming on the surface, then they were swimming on the bottom, and it was interesting. You could see them swimming around the kelp forests. And what happened is the camera had a sonar pinger in it, so you could follow it with a hydrophone, so it would be ding, ding, and you could know which direction it was in. And more or less how strong the strength of the pinger was, you would know more or less how far the Criticam was from you. And then once the galvanic link separated from the shark, or broke, and the camera separated from the shark, it would drift to the surface. It was slightly buoyant, and it had a radio antenna which put out a radio signal which you could pick up from far away. You could pick it up from almost line of sight. So we stuck this camera onto a great white shark, and it was the first time it had ever been done. And like I say, we got incredible footage back, and we did it in Straits Bay as well. And in Straits Bay as well, you'd see the shark swimming right below the surface, just below the surface, and you could see sunlight coming in, and suddenly the shark would drop down like that. And there was one occasion where the shark's swimming, and it's cruising along the surface, and it goes down and it's cruising along the reef, and you suddenly see it speeding up, and boom, it attacks something and kills it. And you actually see the prey flopping and dangling out the shark's mouth as it's feeding on this, whatever it was. We couldn't identify what it attacked. But to me, it looked like a smaller shark that it attacked. But you actually saw the great whites rushing off this thing and attacking it. So that was the first time that anybody had put a camera on a great white shark, and it was challenging, you know, and sometimes we lost the camera. And the galvanic link, today you just push a button and the thing would release. You could have a release system like that. But in those days, we didn't have anything like that. So the galvanic links we had to mess around with them, and depending on the water temperature, etc., they would melt faster or slower, whatever. So you never exactly knew how long this thing was going to be on the shark. The idea was to have it on the shark for about 2 hours at a time, or 90 minutes, yeah, an hour and a half. And I remember the one time we put this camera onto a shark, and we tracked it, and we tracked it, and we tracked it for hours and hours and hours. And for some reason, it just never released from the animal. It wouldn't release from the shark. And eventually we had to go back. And Greg Marshall was obviously distraught, you know. He only had 2 of these cameras. So you don't want to lose this equipment. And you also don't want to lose the footage, the potential footage you've got out there. There's a lot of expectation. And in those days, in 93, 94, on that particular documentary, the budget was $1.3 million, which is a huge budget. Even in today's standards, it's a very, very big budget. So in those days, it was just unheard of. And we went over budget, of course. So I think ended up at $1.5 million to make that documentary, or even more. So you don't want to lose equipment, you don't want to lose footage, a lot of pressure on you. And this camera never came off the shark. So eventually we went back to shore, and Greg went out trying to find it, and he took his radio antenna, and he walked up and down the beach, and he went onto high areas, and just couldn't find this thing. And for some reason, I don't know why, even till today, for some reason my father got up really early in the morning, and he was there he was there part of the shoot. He wasn't on the boats, but he was, you know, he was in the management side of things and making sure everything was working well, because we were working from sun up till sundown every single day, and we had a big crew. It was a big crew. I'm talking about later on. So we first did the critter cam, and then the BBC, and we put it on and we made sure it could work. The BBC went away, and then they came back, and then we spent months filming. So now I'm talking about the period where we were filming for months. So we had a big operation, and I had a turnaround crew, you know, boat crews. We had several boats on the water. But my dad gets up one morning that after the critter cam has disappeared. Greg has not slept all night. He's in such a state. And my father, and he's exhausted because he's also been up for hours. So my dad goes to him and says, Greg, give me that radio thing. And I don't know how he did it, but he went out and he took a 4x4 and he went driving down the beach, and he pulls out this radio thing, and he picks up the signal, and he sits there for quite a while, and he makes sure the shark, it's not just a blip and then the shark's gone again. The signal remains constant, tung, tung, tung. So he rushes back to the house, back into Gansbaai, and he wakes us up, and he says, I located the camera. So we rush out there, and Greg is so excited, and we get to a place called Pearly Beach, and the camera has, thank goodness, there's a lot of kelp, because the waves are breaking and the camera has been smashed to pieces on the rocks and on the beach and that. But before the waves, there's a kelp bed, it's a kelp bed, a kelp forest. And the camera came off the shark at some point, and it drifted into the kelp forest, and it was just lying there in the kelp, completely safe. And we idled the boat in, and we picked up the camera. But this is quite funny, because in the footage, after the camera brought the camera back, perfect condition, took out the tape, watched the footage, you actually see the camera break away from the shark. And the shark was completely aware of the camera there all the time, because the camera breaks away from the shark, and the shark is probably about 5 or 6 meters below the surface. And you see the shark swimming away from the camera, and the camera, then the shark goes out of out of focus or out of lens, and the camera slowly drifts to the surface. And as the camera hits the surface, you see the shark coming back, and the shark comes right up to the camera and bumps it on the front of the camera like that to look at it. So the shark comes up, doesn't try and bite the camera or anything, just comes up to investigate what this thing was that had been hanging on its back for hours, for the last 10 hours or whatever it may have been. So I think that's a pretty cool story. Interesting story.